Recording is on. Hello, this is Wednesday, May the 4th. We're having a conversation today with Kate Booth and Tristan Sykes, who are in Tasmania. They're the co-founders of Just Collapse, which is, I believe, an activist platform dedicated to justice in face of inevitable and irreversible global collapse. Thank you very much for going south, for organizing this. So let's start, and maybe we start with maybe you want to talk to us about a little bit what you're doing first, so we discover you. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Tristan. Thanks very much for having us at Going South. I just wanted to say, I think I may be wrong, but I believe some work was done on the methane monster. I seem to recall by Going South some time ago, and I haven't caught anything recently, but I seem to recall that some really good work was done back then. And anyway, I'm really glad to be here. Yeah, like you say, Just Collapse is a platform dedicated to justice in face of irreversible collapse, and I presume that, from what I recall, that this group of people is very aware that that collapse is inevitable, and so we argue that context for action. Context for action requires an understanding of that predicament, and that action taken outside of the appropriate context, i.e. collapse, is effectively maladaptive and not really of any utility. So I suppose that's a start of what we're about.
And I'm Kate Booth, and I kind of do Just Collapse by night, and I'm an academic by day, sort of. Sometimes mix up those two things. So we started Just Collapse about 7 months ago. So we're quite new to the collapse doom scene. And we'd spent the pandemic. We used to be involved with Extinction Rebellion and, let's change the world, rah, rah, rah. And we spent the pandemic having lots of conversations about all the things that didn't make sense, including climate action, including the demands of organisations like Extinction Rebellion, including things like you just can't escape from destructive behaviour because our civilization is built on overshoot and a range of violence to people and places and other species as a consequence of that. So, yeah, we spent a lot of time talking, and we decided that, and you might have questions or you might want to challenge us on this. We're really open to a discussion. We decided that in the face of a crumbling world, that justice was all that remained. And other people have said other things, like Guy McPherson talks about love, and other people have different focuses. And we decided justice, which is a focus on fairness and equity, was the most useful thing that made sense to us that could be done. And then also, we might talk about it later, but rethinking what justice means, because it's collapse. So there's no denial of the horrors of collapse. But yeah, that's...
Yeah.
Stop talking.
So, I mean, I can clarify that a bit. There's just notions of justice that are Leviathan in their nature, that are all encompassing, are not something that we advocate or engage in. We don't have a notion that the world is going to be made over as a bright green world, or a dark green world either,
or a just world,
we don't have illusions in this regard. We're merely we recognize that the collapse is the context, and useful action can be had, because it's that we're on the way down, but we're not we're not there yet, and there's collapse is a process, and it's not a switch. So we've got stuff to do, and we're advocating that doing that, and the first aspect of doing that is to talk collapse, because it's still a taboo subject, and particularly in environmental and climate circles, we find. So I don't know if that's your experience. I'd be interested to hear about anybody else's experience.
Yeah, I guess I'm really interested to begin with in hearing from everyone on this link about where you come from, where you're at in terms of collapse and the doomosphere and things. That would be really interesting if you wanted to share.
Because some people are collapse aware, but they're not collapse accepting, and some people believe we can navigate our way out of it, and that there is some kind of future on the other side. Some people don't. I'm interested to see where people are at. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, should Tristan say something first because he's the invitee, or what should I say something about the Extinctionati?
No, you go ahead.
So,
Tristan is saying
okay.
that the battery is very low on his laptop. I hope you can charge it.
Oh, okay. Look, yes, Kate and Tristan, I'll just give you a little bit of background, because you've probably got some familiarity with Tristan and his specific interest in ice, and that's his area of specialty. And the rest of us are the Desiderata Extinctionati, and we're very much into the deep doom awareness, I guess you could say. We certainly don't have a problem with any of the points that you've mentioned there. Actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to just sort of pursue with you several things. But I think firstly, getting the impression that you said you were XXR, what were your reservations or concerns regarding XR and not being involved there anymore, or setting up your own thing? What was sort of behind that? Could you spend a minute on that?
Well, look, I know that we've got time, but I'll try not to take up too much time in this regard.
Yeah, we won't open up the can of worms too.
No, just a little pocket description will do, because there's plenty of other things to talk about.
Well, I took on a significant role of state coordinator for Extinction Rebellion in Tasmania, having started Occupy here previously, and so I spoke to the national people at the national level about it, and I didn't really want the role, but there was no one there to stand up. So I thought, okay, well, I'll take this role, and I found the organisation very complicated on a number of levels, fatally complicated on a number of levels, and one of them is structurally like Occupy, the self-organising system lends itself to anybody being involved. And when I was in Occupy, we had people from the Tea Party. This is, right-wing libertarian, I suppose. We had people from that. We had young liberals. These are neoliberal market conservatives. We had people from, the breadth and depth of society getting involved with different agendas in Occupy. And it was similar in Extinction Rebellion. So it's the same sort of flawed model that leads to this problem at a structural level. And so so we got heaps of members. People were just piling on, and we were growing like wildfire. I took on the role with 100 people, and before you know it, there were 1,000 involved. But doing so, it really watered down the nature of what the intent was, because the intent, as I understood it, was to take radical action and to
Oh, you've just dropped out there, Tristan. Can you just go back and say the last sentence or two? You dropped out completely. I don't know if anyone else missed you as well.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, look, I was under the misapprehension that the role of XR was to occupy and disrupt cities, which I had a background of, from Occupy, and thought that this was a useful endeavor to affect demands, because that was the point. They had 3 demands. You want to affect demands. How do you affect demands? Well, you've got to meet power with power, and you do that by shutting down cities. So it's all seemed legitimate to me, but in effect, that wasn't what happened, because the more people you get involved, and at a structural level, if it's come one, come all, then like Occupy, the people who turn up, a lot of them weren't interested in that kind of action. A lot of them thought that action was not the right way to go. In fact, the biggest battle I had in the first year of trying to run this organization was trying to get arrestable action on the table.
Yeah. I'll just give a little bit more background. That one of the abiding preoccupations of our group for quite some time was watching XR from a distance, especially in the UK, and our illustrious leader, who unfortunately suddenly passed away earlier this year, was we actually had spent a long time wanting to get into a rather deep discussion with XR, specifically with Roger Hallam at the time, and it actually took us a long time to get hold of him, and we began a dialogue with them. Because it appeared that they were largely being ineffective. It did appear to be a tragic waste of resources, so the amount of time and effort and numbers of people who were involved for results which were pretty questionable. Unfortunately, our project stalled. We're sort of in the process now of trying to resurrect it, but not with a great deal of hope for various reasons. I won't go into all that now. But I think, I don't want to hog the meeting too much, but do you want to just jump in the deep end here with some sort of hard questions about this kind of activism? The first thing is, I think, the fixation on non-violent direct action, which, if I can just put this to you, I'm not trying to shove anything down your throat, but the point is, if this predicament that humanity and the planet is in is as serious as we would agree that it is, then you're going to have to use any resource that you have. It's more or less gloves off, because this is a desperate situation, and I can't help but think that by insisting on the non-violent and disruptive activities end of this, I can't help but think of the analogy that if Russia rolled up at the doors of Ukraine and said, look, here, we're egregiously offended, we're going to take over your country, but we're not going to bring any guns with us, we're just going to sort of walk in and sit on the road, I don't think they'd get very far. And I'm not saying that your group or XR should be out there trying to take out the constabulary or anything like that. And certainly, if you were, you wouldn't want to be making that public. But I think at some stage, something a little bit more than this Mr. Nice Guy thing, passive resistance, and is going to be necessary because of the state's monopoly on power. Now, look, I might just keep quiet there. If you've got a comment you want to make just at that point, just so I don't go too far down the track.
I was
Can I
just
just jump in
confirming.
a second? Can I
Yeah.
just jump in a second? Because before, Gary, you were saying, Kate and Tristan, you were asking our background, and Gary very well summarized our position on having grasped the seriousness of our predicament and our position with XR. We also more than, well, we're doomers. You understand we are. We don't like labels. We're also concentrating a lot on psychological preparation for collapse. That's another thing that we might come at the end, but before you go back to. And there is a strong, very strong streak of anarchism going through the group. Not saying that we belong to anything, but it is what inspired our leader and what inspired our leader, our founder, our guru, whatever you want to call him.
It's just our in joke. Don't worry about that.
Leader in an anarchist group, but you know what I mean. So I just wanted to add that too. You know, there is that very much at the core. So now carry on with the comments on what Gary said.
Yeah, it just speaks to where we come from as well. So our critique of the climate and environmental movement is that they lack an adequate critique of power. They think that the government is ultimately on their side and sees the world through very white middle class values, and they will act because, of course, they will, because they're us, and why wouldn't anyone do exactly what we want to do? And they don't understand that nation states have been, will respond in a completely different way than what the climate environment movement expect and want. The agendas are completely different. And one of the flaws with Extinction Rebellion is that they can't change their demands. They have 3 demands that were set in 2019, and occasionally someone comes up with a 4th one and then that disappears, or they twiddle a bit, but there's no structure to change the demands. So everything is now totally out of date, unresponsive to changing politics, unresponsive to changing understandings of the severity of the predicament. And I was astounded going into an Extinction Rebellion to find out that you had to make a case for doing a disruptive action. Like, I was like, what are you talking about? So we try and adopt I guess it's an anarchist or decentralized model. We don't consider, I'll let Tristan go, but we don't consider ourselves a group. We're a platform. We've got some ideas. We're putting them out there. What will be, will be.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Oh, sorry, I'll let you talk.
Oh, look, yeah, the XR was incredibly heavy on the bureaucracy and not in any kind of useful way. And it was extraordinary how they would invent again and again new processes for doing what used to be done next week. But there was a whole lot of busyness and very little actual action or any kind of real campaigning as I'd previously experienced it. I thought, yes, it was very unfortunate because there was lots of well-meaning, but it was ultimately disastrous and now is effectively sucking up oxygen. And it really is the zombie that must die.
But it's important to say that they were significant in 2019 for shifting the zeitgeist. So they had a key role to play in climate change coming to everyone, front of mind.
And look, I want to say, acknowledging what I think Bob was it Bob or Gary was saying regarding non-violence, inverted commas. The reality is that all change that has ever been affected, has involved challenging power directly, and challenging power directly. Sometimes that stuff gets messy, and
South Africa, the suffragettes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Civil rights.
Yeah, and well, I mean, Ireland's a great example too. So
yeah, it's a great pity that you weren't that we didn't meet a few months ago. You would have benefited hugely from talking with Hugh, but you'll have to make do with second best, which is us. I think he would have been deeply moved and helped actually. But if we're just going to try and keep this to an hour or so, is that we might just move on a little bit, which is, I mean, regarding Just Stop Oil, you're not limiting yourself just to that particular aspect, are you? Or you feeling that it's better just to focus on one thing? What's happening there?
What's up? How do we feel about Just Stop Oil?
Well, I mean, you wanting to focus just specifically on that, or you're wanting to be acting more generally, that anything that will sort of disrupt global industrial civilization.
We view all of that as sort of maladaptive action. That if you stop fossil fuels, you exacerbate collapse. Of course, collapse is inevitable, but the ending fossil fuels. One, you can't end fossil fuel use. I mean, it will end, of course, but you can't. It's not politically possible to stop fossil fuels. Billions of people rely on the use of fossil fuels. We've overinflated, through overshoot, our population to nearly 8 billion people, and there is no way to sustain that population without fossil fuels. You get rid of fossil fuels, and people start dying, and countries implode, and wars start, and it all goes to shit. It's not in any way a useful mode of activism. It doesn't recognize the problem, recognize the predicament. The predicament is not a carbon, it's not a pollution problem. It's a whole wicked problem of overshoot and yeah. So I mean that's my position on Just Stop Oil and things, and Blockade Australia and things like that, I suppose. Kate, do you have anything to say in that regard?
Yeah, so our approach, we're very, as Tristan said earlier, we're very focused on Talk Collapse. That's our campaign at the moment, because without a collapse conscious citizenry, speak, you can't take any action in the context of collapse, or plan for collapse. Now, our approach to planning for collapse is decentralized. So it's place-based. It's based on local places, largely because we're all going to become a lot more isolated, and also because every place is unique. So there might be global drivers to collapse, environmental, climatic, economic, political, but ultimately every place has got its own features. So collapse will look different in different places. And we've explored the idea of insurgent planning, which is a grassroots form of community mobilization to act for community interests in the face of local issues arising through collapse. So that's where our kind of activist focus would be, though we also have
We can't hear you anymore. You're muted. Your microphone is turned off.
Thanks.
Sorry, I don't know how that happened. Anyway, blah, blah.
Yeah, so basically you're looking at a consciousness raising exercise to get people to really understand the significance of collapse, get it out of the realm of either denial or abstraction, I guess. It's basically what you're looking at by the sound of it.
Yeah, that's the first step, Gary. You can't do much without a collapse conscious citizenry. people who aren't aware of the predicament can't plan for collapse. People who are aware can, and so that's you've got. But if you're the maladaption of activism seems to be, they don't recognize the predicament, but they're taking action and thinking that somehow that this is useful. But in fact, a lot of the action is effectively creating more of the problem that they're trying to solve. And that's why films like Bright Green Lies by Deep Green Resistance have been useful in trying to expose some of this, and some useful academic papers have come out around renewable energy and how how ineffective that is in terms of addressing the nature of our predicaments. And
what do you think about because we often discussed what could be called accelerationism, which was carrying out strategic sabotage to accelerate the cessation of industrial society. The rationale for that being that stopping global industrial civilization sooner rather than later might enable some niches of natural habitat to remain intact, and maybe some small number of human beings to still be able to survive. Whereas if it runs its course, and the worst case scenario plays out in every instance, which is the course we're currently on, then you could be looking at just leaving a scorched earth behind. So we had those discussions, and so the question just regarding that is that looking at the global situation now with the effects of the pandemic, and now with this military situation going on and great disruptions, is I'm beginning to wonder whether the kind of civilization that we have has now become so dysfunctional that the quickest way to bring it down is just to let it bring itself down, because it is seeming to be in a stage of radical self-destructiveness. So I'm just sort of just questioning whether action is required. Obviously, as you're saying, you're confining. One of your main things is to get people aware of collapse. I'm just wondering whether, in a certain sense, activism has become superseded by the action of reality. I don't know if you've got a comment to make on that.
I think it's a really interesting question, Gary, and I think our position might have changed, but Tristan has just left the room, so he might say something different. But knowledge of the climate impacts that are locked in and the ecological impacts that are locked in suggest that reality supersedes activism in the form of ending infinite growth on a finite planet by blowing up this, that, or the other, or whatever. But I think there's also, because our focus is on justice, it's what just outcomes are possible, and that's human and non-human. So we've talked about shutting down nuclear power plants ASAP, so that at least if life on Earth survives in some form, that there isn't toxicity. But then we go and look into what it takes to shut down some of the older nuclear power plants, and you can't do it.
It's like 30 or 40 years of work, even for the people who know how to do it. It's a very slow, expensive process,
It will still leave a toxic footprint. So
unfortunately, in this view, that the way of looking at things the way you are and the way we are, you come up against some difficult thoughts. And you know, on the one hand, whilst you're trying to raise consciousness of the reality and significance of collapse, you're going. I think there's going to be a lot of kickback from like normies, so to speak, the sort of bulk of ordinary clueless people who are going to perceive, you know, well, they already are, I guess, as a result of what's going on in Europe, perceiving the shortages of fuel and food, and that is sort of this direct assault on their personal existences, and so there's this enormous momentum going to be this enormous momentum amongst ordinary people to want to try and keep the machine running, and you know, I don't know. Realistically, do you see that you can affect that very much, because you know, when you get down to the nitty gritty of it, a lot of these people are just going to die, and you know, can you really blame them if they want to try and hang on, even if it means hanging on to oil? You know.
Totally don't blame them. No, totally don't blame them. That is the nature of the beast of global modern techno-industrial civilization. It's going to hang on for as long as it possibly can. There will be various more geoengineering projects, and they will try to keep this, you know, unsustainable thing going for as long as possible. And you know, what's politically possible and what we can see would make sense in terms of physics, chemistry, and ecology, they will just never meet, because it's not politically possible. It doesn't matter how much activism or whether or not you shut down cities or not. It's not possible to actually do what is required. The only thing that can be done is what is going to happen, which is collapse. And that can happen by disaster, or it can happen by design if we were going to consciously do it. But let's face it, there's not going to be any appetite for that, because that involves, as soon as you start collapsing the system, billions of people die. So it is what it is, which is that the collapse will happen, and people will have to, you know, sort of navigate their way through that as best as possible, with all the shrieking and misery and death that comes with it.
Yeah, which is, you know, we're trying to be realistic. We're not trying to, you know, we've heard over the decades so many false promises. You know, if we just do A, B, and C, we will have a bright green future. Or if we just do X, Y, and Z, we'll have a lovely dark green future. And we try not to do that. We try and stick in reality, which is why we're interested in insurgent planning, because at key moments or part of the process of collapse, people are going to need to band together and look after themselves. And if we can influence of small or sow the seeds in some people's heads about thinking about justice and equity and fairness in the context of collapse. So again, no false promises there. But if we put that principle up front, then perhaps the descent can be eased in some places some of the time. But yeah, we as I said, no false promises from us. We're not selling some kind of utopia or anything. It's just, what can we do? Well, this seems like a realistic option. I will just post in the chat our description of insurgent planning.
Yep. Okay. I was just going to ask about that, so that's good if you could. Yeah.
May I ask you a question? Because we have been talking, as this group has been in discussions on several occasions with members of, American members of Deep Green Resistance, such as Derek Jensen and Leah Keith and a few other people. So we're very in tune with their writing, their analysis, and it seems to be also what you see, the bright green lies, the whole thing. Another thing I wanted to add. Oh, it just escaped my mind. It was when you were talking, and I just forget what it is. Oh yeah, you were talking about the reaction of what's going to happen with collapse, and an example that that Hugh, our ex founder, was very much fond of was the reaction of people during Storm Katrina in New Orleans years ago. How actually, without any organization, people got together and people supported each other, and he always had a very non-Darwinian approach to the way humans actually have evolved, which is not by competition but by cooperation and mutual aid. And I think we need to keep that also in mind, that we're not looking at things like the preppers. We're not looking at things like get your bunker in order and your guns and your stash of food, and it's not exactly what we. It doesn't mean that we deny any aspects of prepping, which is sourcing your food, being adjusted to shortages and of energy and all sorts of things that are going to happen down the line. But we are very much thinking that there is a big majority of humanity that will spontaneously go towards justice and mutual aid. But we don't want to fall into that view of the world that this society has tried to model in a lot of Hollywood movies and horror stories of Mad Max and stuff like that. So we're keeping that in the equation, and as much as decentralizing and localizing everything if we can. That's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, I think you're right. In fact, insurgent planning is inevitable. It's an inevitable part of collapse. It's just that I suppose sowing the seeds is of trying to facilitate people to create that community, or have it in their mind to do so when states inevitably fail, because many states are failing and have failed, and there is a lot more of that to come, of course. And in that period, there's an opportunity to take up insurgent planning, or that people will not, won't call it insurgent planning when they, when it's happening, I'm sure, but in many cases, but it is a useful notion, because it's an opportunity to find some measure of equity and fairness in an otherwise horrific situation. I totally agree that, evolutionary speaking, we are designed to we're mutual cooperation, mutual aid. That's what human beings do. That's how we managed to get to this point. So
yeah, it's just about. Sorry, Tristan.
No, you jump in.
It's just about the only explanation about why we've ended up with 8 billion people on the planet, because we occasionally binge watch Netflix as escapism, and shows about the Vikings where everyone's killing each other all the time. We're like, I know this isn't historically accurate, but how on earth did we get 8 billion people on the planet? So the ideas behind insurgent planning have largely developed and originated in the developing world, in communities and places that are under more real life pressures than we are in the West. So often when we talk about insurgent planning to people in white, middle class, comfortable existences, they describe it as theoretical. And they're like, how do we get a community together to do this? Because it seems so distant from everyday life, where everyone's in their individual homes doing their own individual things. But the case studies and research about insurgent planning from other parts of the world, where people are dealing with food insecurity or housing insecurity or energy and water insecurity, people are doing insurgent planning all over the place. And it's because they have to. And because a key resource we have as humans, as
each other,
as the other speaker just said, is each other. So yeah, I shouldn't have said anything about the Vikings because I've just binge watched too much Netflix. It's all ahistoric.
Yeah, I think I just what was crossing my mind while you were talking there about people living in less, affluent Western places, which is, the number of people who live in cities where their scope is a lot more limited in regard to self-sufficiency. They're probably the places where it's a kind of a pressure cooker, as collapse occurs, with the lack of options that people in urban areas have got, and spread of disease and all this kind of thing happening there. I don't know. Do you find more resonance with people in rural areas, or have you noticed anything in particular like that?
I'm trying to think. I mean, there's a retired farmer that we've had a lot of engagement within Twitter, and he's very effective at bursting these myths around alternative food production methods. That permaculture can feed the world. We don't have a problem with permaculture, obviously, or organic farming, or regenerative farming, but it's just not going to feed the world. So that's been useful to hear his perspective because he's farmed. He knows he needs a tractor with fuel in it, and he knows how hard the work is. And then we've had some engagement. We got contacted by a group in Panama that are setting up an intentional community and could see resonance with what we were saying about insurgent planning. So that's fantastic to hear, that what we're saying makes sense to people in other parts of the world. But
somewhere in Africa and creating permaculture communities. Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not opposed to permaculture. It comes from Tasmania, in fact. We just recognise that there are 8 billion people on the planet, and that the degree of overshoot is so extreme that, for example, in Tasmania, where we are, which is it's a relatively big island. It's in comparison to, say, for example, European countries. Like Australia's a big place, but Tasmania, the little island that we live in at the bottom, it's still pretty sizable, relatively speaking. And at the moment, we've got 500,000 people on this island. But when the indigenous pre-colonial civilization ran the show here, there were maybe 10, maybe 20,000 people here. And that was with intact ecosystems. This was with fauna and flora that was flourishing. This isn't the situation. This isn't anything like the situation that we have now. If we were to see the end of industrial civilization here, and the people somehow still continue to live, I can't imagine that there could be very many people that this island could sustain. It would be much less than 10,000. So they get just a perspective on, what collapse ultimately means in terms of living a sustainable sort of lifestyle. I mean, I don't really believe that there is any kind of future for humans. Once the civilization goes here, all those nuclear reactors, and I don't really see it myself. But I'm more than willing to be proven wrong, because boy, that sounds great. But yeah, this is the situation in Tasmania. We were talking earlier today yesterday with somebody from Seattle, and on their show, on their Quillwood podcast, from Vermont, and they were saying the same thing, that there was only 5,000 to 10,000 people pre-colonialization in what is now called Vermont, and that was with intact ecosystems.
And a relatively stable climate, and,
yeah.
and we're catapulting towards a radically unstable climate. So,
yeah. So you're looking at a population much lower.
If I may say that this corroborates what we've been saying for years, really, about the fact that collapse of civilization was inbuilt in probably the way we developed about 10,000 years ago, that collapse is not a recent thing. The moment we started agriculture and the moment we started building cities, we went down that road. It's just that the recent boom in population due to the scientific discoveries and health and all these sort of technologies just accelerated the process. But we're in this for thousands and thousands of years. You know, the elephant in the room is the hunter-gatherer situation where we moved from, and we have been advocating a bit. Well, some people on this group have been advocating maybe a nomadic approach also to survival. I personally, I'm land-based, and I'm a gardener, and I've got, you know, just a little community, and there's hardly nobody where I live, and so yeah, there is a prospect maybe of surviving, but you don't know with the sea rising and stuff like that, you know, and the change in climate, what's going to grow and what sort of game and birds will be around. We haven't a clue. So making any plans for permaculture if there's no bees and no and ice or heat is yeah, we go back again to localizing and things like that. So there is no solution that fits all. But you know, we're in this for a long time, and we're seeing just an acceleration in the last 100 years. Yeah, some of our one of our member who passed away recently was advocating sea steading. He was living on a boat, and he thought that was a survival plan that he was trying to encourage people to follow, maybe as a flotilla or as a, you know, kind of pirate kind of way of thinking, and, you know, living on the sea. Everybody's got their talents, their skills, their geographical positions and age and whatever. So these are going to be personal choices, I think, and they can't be theorized and put in books. Like we were extremely critical of the approach of Jem Bendell and deep adaptation, even though there was a lot of good things in the idea of deep adaptation, and we are not denying that deep adaptation has to happen, but these type of I personally encountered some people from these movements that were also linked with XR and all that, and I didn't want to go there. It was just really, really dangerous territory. They were completely not realistic, and you know, it was actually psychologically very destructive type of approach to adaptation, I think, personally. Sorry, Gary, I cut in when you were going to say something. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I was enjoying what you were saying. Well, I think seeing you came up quite close to it, we should just point out that part of our little group here was very much looking at because there's a totally different way you can approach the human predicament now, which is as a mass psychological problem that leads humanity to being unable to see what it is doing to the world and see what it's doing to itself in a very honest way. And I don't just mean being like in denial or not being sufficiently aware. It's a matter of a lack of spiritual connection, and that was something that we worked with quite a bit was a question of, I guess what you could call spiritual awakening. In other words, getting people out of their ego investment, because it's got a lot to do with the way that they, in a similar way to the way people cling to their personal identity and their concerns about self, then transfers to clinging to the civilization and the concerns with survival in the bigger picture, and it's this matter of not actually being able to let go, as scary as it might be. People's inability to do that, it's locked us into this self-destructive pathway, both individually and as a as a sort of civilization and planetary level as well. So there was the importance of dealing with this was because if we even go back to what you're saying about your insurgency planning and wanting people to appreciate collapse and all the rest of it, a lot of what makes that a bit of an uphill battle is that people will still want to be clinging to the familiar thing and in themselves and the familiar thing in the world, because it's not just a matter of practicality. It's a matter of a kind of inner, a personal shift that can be impossibly difficult for people to either make within themselves or to even contemplate, because it's really a relinquishing of their whole identity, of their whole way of seeing themselves. I'm just wondering if you sort of considered the actual psychological, how can I put it? Not so much a psychological. It's just a sort of momentum of civilization, but there's also this psychological momentum. As we're invested in oil and dependent on oil, we're also invested in this, identity thing as well. So I don't know. I mean, if you thought of working at that level as well, of working at this level of fundamentally what is it with human beings that is blocking them from acting sanely at a time like this?
Yeah, we tend to stay clear of psychology, partly because, and perhaps this relates to something that was just said before, we don't have the capacity or expertise to help people who are struggling as individuals, and you tend to get a lot of that in places like deep adaptation. We tend to be more political. But we have picked up a recent shift because we spend a lot of time on social media. That's where we do a lot of our talk collapse work. And there's been a shift where, a little while ago, climate activists were saying, we're going to change the world. We've got this. There's just enough time. It's all, we've got this. And now people are saying that they're almost collapse accepting, except that they're saying, we're doing this because we want to go down on the right side of history. And I think that shift is interesting, but it's also, I find, really disturbing because there's so much to be done at the moment that is not about one's sense of self as being on the right side of history. I think perhaps I've spoken to what you've just said, Gary.
Can I jump in there on that? So I would, from a psychological perspective, again, like Kate, I would say, we stay clear of individual psychology, but in terms of political psychology, there's definitely stuff to be done. So our effort, and one of the reasons why our current campaign is Talk Collapse, is because we recognise that much more effective than taking sort of physical action for us is to affect zeitgeist shifting. And if we can change, if you starting little conversations and implanting little seeds, little ideas, these bubble and boil and froth and churn, and then start popping up, as we're noticing in other places. The conversation is expanding. It's becoming more not mainstream, but more acceptable to talk collapse, and becomes more acceptable. Then it bubbles up in the consciousness, and you affect a zeitgeist shift. And and then people are, you enter a new position. So I suppose from a psychological perspective, in terms of changing the very maladaptive, egocentric rather than ecocentric sort of paradigm, affecting that zeitgeist change, that's useful work that can be done, and that's part of the Talk Collapse campaign for sure. I hope that answers.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's I think I was just thinking while you were saying that, shifting the zeitgeist, that it's interesting to see that operating on a significant scale regarding the pandemic, where initially certain narratives regarding that were quite taboo and people wouldn't touch them, and then progressively they became quite widely discussed. I mean, it went from total denial of the lab origins of the disease, and to this not being very, very challenging to talk about anymore, and of course quite a lot of other sub issues to do with it. But so you can see the power of that, shifting the narrative into a more constructive realm, where people are better informed and there's more openness, better understanding and more openness about it. It's our concern, sort of spiritually and psychologically, really went back to what Sophie was just saying a minute ago about the origins of civilization, because that was also the turning point from the kind of ecological the sense of unity with the natural environment began to be broken with civilization and the setting up of hierarchical societies and priestly castes and that kind of connection became annexed and morphed itself into religions, which were just another kind of control structure. And so, we've ended up with this very sort of top-heavy kind of heavily managed society, instead of one that is, primarily in tune with its environment. But I guess just going back to what you were saying about the shifting the zeitgeist there, there's a substantial power in like the media and the governments, the political structure, which are very much involved in the project of denying or not really talking about this in any honest way. And I don't know how have you got any thoughts about the I mean, you look at the current election in Australia with campaigns which are absolutely farcical in terms of anything meaningful. I don't know if you've got any comments just to make about that, for instance.
Yeah, I'd love to. So to me, I think the two major parties are irrelevant, and I think politics as usual, like business as usual, is also pretty irrelevant. The beast doesn't really have a driver. It goes in the direction that it must go. It must go in terms of growth. That is its trajectory. The boat cannot be steered around, not by anybody. The boat must go into the iceberg. That is where it's going, and then it's going to sink. That's it. It doesn't matter who you vote for. Particularly, my big problem is with the Greens. They are the people that I would go after. They're the people that need to be held to account. You've got to punch from the left to the left to affect an Overton window shift. You don't go slamming the Conservatives on the right. That doesn't. It's pointless. If you're going to be politically effective, give the Greens a kicking.
So the idea of collapse